So I put the agenda for this meeting of the Committee on Leveraging Resources there in the chat. Really, this first meeting, we should use this as an opportunity to sort of orient ourselves, get this committee's structure established. I can provide some information on the conversations we had in the legislative committee that met last week, along with a couple other folks on this call who are also a member of that committee, because I think an important conversation today around our committee duties and scope will be the sort of overlap or separation between this group and the legislative committee. And then we can talk about scheduling meetings into the future as well. So let's do roll call real quick here. I'm just going to read off the names of the folks on the committee just for record's sake. And just say here, we have quite a few people who couldn't make it today or are going to be late. So I'll make note of them when they arrive. But Amy Moyer.
Here.
Christina Burry. Not here. Christy Belton.
Here.
John Ring.
Here.
Selwyn Whiteskunk. Not here. Pat Dorsey, not here. Hillary Cooper.
I am here.
Brett Wolk.
Here.
Bon Jones, not here, might be late. And Paige Lewis, who I also don't think can make it today. Ben Tisdall as well. Okay, great. So the first order of business is that I would love for us to elect a committee chair who will work with me to develop the agenda and then actually chair these meetings. So, be the one to make sure folks are getting called on and that we're moving through our agenda items. So, I would anticipate this would require a sort of couple of hours of work per week. Commissioner Shattuck McNally, go ahead.
I'm sorry, maybe my ears are not prickly. Did you call my name? I don't remember if you did.
I did not, nope. We were just talking about committee chair elections, and Commissioner Shattuck McNally was elected chair of our legislative committee, so thank you for that.
No, but I didn't know for the roll call if you called my name because I didn't hear my name called.
Oh, you're right. I did not. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so does anybody nominate anyone to be chair or would like to nominate themselves? If so, speak up.
Angela, do you want to just I don't think I have a great understanding of exactly our kind of mission and goal as a group here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hesitant to nominate myself, but I'm happy to maybe step up. And so maybe we loop back towards the end to determine a chair or figure out how to loop in the other folks that might not have been able to be here today too.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm happy to do that. So, one of the statutory duties of this council is to make legislative recommendations to the governor and to the state legislature. And so, this group, I think, has the role of digging into, the programs that exist at the state, understanding, what priorities might be for revising programs, creating new programs, reducing duplication, all of those types of sort of policy questions, and then bringing recommendations to the broader council, which would then, vote to advance priorities, to the legislature and to the governor, through the director of DNR, through the leadership of the State Forest Service as well. And so I think, we can have a broad conversation about what that really looks like, recognizing that with the makeup of the council, there may be agency staff, who can't technically advocate for certain things, but I think we can have a conversation about how the sort of council as a whole does that. So hopefully that's helpful for kicking this off. And I'll just put the statutory language here in the chat so that folks can kind of talk about it.
And it sounds like, Angela, the two committees that are active right now, we have the broader Forest Health Council, and then there's a legislative committee and this Leveraging Resources Committee, and those are the two that are kicking off right now. Is that okay?
Yep, that's right. And you know, the council has lots of duties, and these were two of the items that sort of rose to the top in terms of urgency. You know, and I think the third sort of priority that was recognized was around landscape scale planning to identify state level priorities for forest restoration, wildfire risk reduction, and related forest management and barriers to achieving those priorities. So I think that'll probably be kind of next in the queue. And that's more of a, I think it's a slightly different conversation, taking a look at the state, taking a look at the forests across the state and talking about priorities. Whereas, you know, I think this council's charge could be, in terms of making legislative recommendations, could be very broad, given the broad duties of the council. And I'll actually just put the full duties here in the chat. It might be, oh, I don't think I can actually. I'll share my screen instead. You know, because the council is charged with everything from you know, making general recommendations to those landscape scale priorities, you know, monitoring trends in forest health and management, identifying strategies to build capacity for forest management, you know, workforce development, how to promote that within the state. So, you know, in terms of legislative priorities, I think, you know, the conversations can be quite broad. So can people read that okay?
And Angela, is this the General Forest Health Council? What you've been reading is for that's the mission for the Forest Health Council, not for this committee, right?
Sorry, yes. So this is, and I think I got on the legislative committee track. Sorry, I'm obviously recovering from that meeting last week. But so this committee on leveraging resources, you know, I think the role here is to really get a full picture of the resources that are available at the state and potentially at the federal level as well. You know, and making recommendations as to how to leverage those. And I suppose that could involve making recommendations to the legislative committee as well on how, you know, best to do that through legislation. But let me just find the language here. Yeah, so sorry, it's item 6 here. So this committee is really focused on identifying strategies for building and sustaining capacity to conduct forest restoration and wildfire mitigation work at scale through collaboration across agencies, organizations, and jurisdictions, public-private partnerships, innovative public and private funding vehicles, shared stewardship, and other solutions with an emphasis on leveraging and maximizing the impact and reach of state funding. So I think it's maximizing the impact and reach of state funding that's really at the core of this committee's conversations. Yeah, go ahead, Hillary.
Thanks. So one of the reasons I was really interested in this committee was to look at the resources that existed on basically guiding where resources that were leveraged through legislation, basically money, tools, all of that. So establishing, you know, a science-based approach to forest health around the state. It feels very much like we're all sort of trying to develop our own approach. Sorry, Brett's group, whose acronym I'm totally spacing on right now. We'll just call it Brett's group. is, doing a great job, and it would be great if they had the resources to really expand that around the state and do sort of a state modeling project that could help pinpoint the resources that we do have. I mean, is that something you sort of talked there about it being on the back end, which is needed too? Where do we get the money that was created by the legislature? But on the front end, how do we develop a plan, a statewide plan that will be locally specific, science-based? And that's one of the areas that I'm most interested in. We have the amazing resources of CSU and Brett's group and others. And how do we really organize those and get the capacity needed to have that information inform us all moving forward? So is that sort of what you see the scope of this is as well, or is it taking the legislation and making sure it gets out to the ground?
I mean, this is a great question, and I think the meeting today is for all of you to help craft this vision for what this council's role is. I think when we were deciding on, or this committee, when we were deciding on various committees, I was looking at the duties in legislation and in statute, and this one, again, with that language around leveraging and maximizing the impact and reach of state funding, is sort of, I think, at the heart of what I saw this committee's role as. And so to me, there's some questions there around, how do we ensure collaboration with other agencies? How do we ensure state funding is leveraging federal resources and other resources? But you're right that, I think a piece of that could certainly be, if we need to maximize the impact here, can we ask some hard questions about sort of where this work should be happening and, the ways in which it should be funded, to what magnitude it should be funded? I think then there's an important question to ask about how this group's role might relate to, for example, some of the other duties around landscape scale planning to identify state level priorities for forest restoration, and things like monitoring trends in forest ecosystem health. So, I think that's a point of discussion for this committee. Do we feel like we need sort of separate committees working on each of these, or would this committee be interested in taking on some of the sort of spatial prioritization questions that, might be somewhat separate, but certainly inform strategic funding decisions? And feel free to dialogue.
I think when I look at the wording for this group, right, starts with identifying strategies for capacity to do forestry work, but also strategies for collaboration across multiple agency jurisdictions. So you can focus on, like, there's the first part is, I think, what Hillary was getting at, of working on the strategies. And then what you're focusing on in the end is connecting the strategies to the statewide funding sources that are available, right? So that has a lot of overlap with the landscape scale planning, that other bullet up there, obviously. But maybe this is a broader framework to say, this is how this Forest Health Council recommends people should go about collaboration and go about approaching this problem in sort of a shared stewardship way, and come up with a framework for people to use out in the field as well as at the state legislature on how to go about that. So I think that's kind of what I was starting to envision this could do. I think what I don't want it to do is get into like, you should spend your money exactly this way, or I don't know that it's our jurisdiction to tell the State Forest Service or DFPC or any particular agency, right, what to do with a specific program. But our collective thoughts can help develop frameworks to say, let's recommend you use this framework and apply your own personal agency sort of directives within this similar frameworks. something like that. And Hillary, it's Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, CFRI is the acronym. But
Thanks, Brett. It came to me. Sorry, it's a Monday morning.
but I mean, I think one thing that came to mind that is, as far as leveraging resources too, is state resources in particular, is all the other universities around the state, right? It's not
Yeah.
just CSU, but there's Western State, there's lots of places. CU. In addition, I know community colleges do a lot with training people to actually do the work and build the capacity. So it could explode into a very broad conversation depending on how many resources we want to think about at the state level.
Yeah, great question. Amy and John Ring, I would be curious to hear from you if you have thoughts on what you feel like you sort of see on the ground in terms of challenges around leveraging resources and the first part of this duty, which is around sort of best practices for collaboration and working cross boundary, that kind of thing. I'm just curious if you have any key challenges that you see in the field that you feel like need to be addressed.
And I don't know if this is too in the weeds for this group, but just thinking about timelines and interacting with the legislative committee, as looking at some of the most prominent funding sources that are available for forestry work in the state, and identifying either barriers to access or inconsistencies between the funding sources that may prevent the best leveraging of resources. And so teeing up, if we do have recommendations to change some of the statutory language and some of these funding opportunities, or at the state level, or for farm bill conversations, I think this could be a good subcommittee with the diversity here to say, here's our top 5, funding opportunities that communities typically access, and here's the pros and cons to both, and here are recommendations as to how they might work better together. Might be I think would be a really valuable exercise if others think that is in line with our mission here. And then I do think at the same time, some of the comments that Hillary mentioned at the beginning of, even prior to making sure that these funding streams work together better, that we all have some framework that we're pushing in the same direction, so that if we're accessing funding, it's not in a haphazard way of we're treating this area over here, which is great, and this area over here, and that the funding works well together from matching resources, but also works well together on what's happening on the ground, if that makes sense.
Any other thoughts about what people think when they read this legislative language, the statutory language about this committee and some of our activities? Yeah, go ahead, Christy.
So here are my thoughts. I'm not nearly as eloquent as you all are. But I come from a little bit, my perspective is more of like, I'm a rancher. That's why I'm on this council. And I'm also a national forest permittee. And last year, a little bit of our forest permit burned up in a fire here. And so what keeps bubbling up in my simple mind is timeline. And, and if we can develop a framework, I like all the ideas, I think they're good. But my question is more along the lines of, how long do we, bear with me, you guys, but how long do we talk about it? And at what point do we say, okay, let's do some things. You guys all come to the table with a ton of knowledge. I don't know anything about, what you all know, other than I think like I'm the end user. I deal with the results. And again, I don't, forgive me for just being super direct, but I keep thinking like we're just burning up in Colorado as with one hat, we're burning up in Colorado. With my other hat of being on a committee and a council, we're talking about it. And I would like to get to the stage where we start coming up with ideas. And, that's where all of your expertise comes in. And so I feel very impatient because I know what's coming. I know what's around the corner. It's already happening to us all. So my question would be, like, how quickly can we roll up our sleeves and get to work?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Christy. I think I go back to Angela's question and comment about what are the challenges already? Because everybody's trying to coordinate. I see very few people that are like, no, I'm not going to talk to anybody. I'm just going to do my own thing. I think we realize fire is cross-jurisdictional in many ways. So I guess my concern is, we're going to talk about this. Also, what unique powers do we have as part of a Forest Health Council, or what are we going to add that people aren't already doing? Right? What can we do that other groups who are having the same conversation all over the place aren't already trying to coordinate? And I don't know exactly the answer to that because I'm still figuring out what sort of the channels of this council have to do something different that other people aren't.
I guess, oh, go ahead, Christy.
And so just real quick, I know that, in the ranching community and in Colorado, we went through this a few years ago, particularly with water. And there were a lot of people working on water in Colorado, 10 years ago. And they were all able to sort of get on the same page and establish some roundtables and, just a couple of organizations that were able to sort of be the central point. And I'm wondering if that's something that we can also do, try to, encourage basically all the collaborators to have sort of a central, meeting point, resource, whatever we want to call it, where it becomes sort of the known go-to for anything having to do with, forest health and wildfire mitigation. I think that's maybe what we're trying to do. And so it just might take a little while to, it feels to me like we're trying to herd cats right now. And so maybe if we can establish, pick somebody to be a leader, even if it isn't us, maybe it's some other organization who's light years ahead of us. Basically pick a leader, if that's simply put.
Yeah, I think that's a great, that's basically where I'm at on this as well. And I think Brett and CFRI are working on this idea of regional, it's basically GIS optimizations where you use the science on the ground, use the ecology on the ground, you identify values that need protection, and then you take that to the community, and then from that, you go through the stakeholder process and then identify projects that can actually be implemented, and then you direct money into those projects. So, the idea is you're really using a solid approach in order to identify those projects with the greatest chance of success. And we used a very similar project, concept that was sort of one of the first done in the state, but it was done at a very local level. We used Dr. Seibold out of CSU and did a GIS optimization for our upper watershed that was more a modeling project to understand really what the forest was going to look like in 30 years. And so that we could make land use decisions based on that, and we could start to make forest health decisions based on that. And of course, now we're using it for wildfire, to direct wildfire mitigation projects. And it could be updated, and Dr. Seibold was very generous with his time. We didn't pay him half of what what it actually costs to do this kind of thing. But in working on that type of project, he had done the same in the Pitkin County area. I thought, wouldn't it be great if we had this around the state, if each region had this tool and we could take this, basically we developed a story map out of it, and it could direct land use decisions, wildfire mitigation. If you change the layers, if you change the GIS optimization to really focus on water resources, what would that look like? So you create this tool, it's a mapping tool that becomes a highly valuable land use tool. And CFRI is doing the same thing. We tried to sign up with CFRI and realize, that they're backlogged because it is such a popular concept right now. So how do we ensure that that is done in a somewhat uniform way with science that is available then through a community stakeholder process to, quick enough to direct the money that's then created. There's a lot of money being created at the legislature this year, even more money than last year, or more money on top of last year's. And how do we develop that kind of tool? Maybe I'm a little ahead on this, but how do we develop that kind of GIS optimization tool for all regions around the state to be able to direct those funds and change as needed, according to what the values are on the ground or changing conditions, et cetera. And there's a lot of people asking those questions. There's a lot of people doing the work without enough resources to actually, get out there and be effective at sort of a statewide level. So that's one of my big interest areas, is how do we facilitate that around the state as quickly as possible, using the existing, knowledge base that we have to be able to then leverage the resources that are being created through state legislature and other National Forest Foundation, et cetera.
Yeah, anyone else have thoughts on that? Yeah, go ahead, Christy.
Is there any sort of like a flow chart for what's out there? Kind of what programs do what, who's leading, in a certain area, and then also maybe what funding is available and whether it's, state or local, or is there any sort of a flow chart? And if not, can we create one? I'm happy to volunteer. I'm usually not one to complain without at least some sort of a solution. So I'd be happy to delve into that and try to come up with something if it doesn't exist.
Great, thanks for that offer, Christy. So this is a request from the legislative committee as well, basically to see, sort of the master spreadsheet of programs at the state level and potentially federal level that are available and active, and funding amounts associated with those, what types of work it can fund. And so we at the state have a few versions of this, but we don't really have a master sheet right now. So we definitely need to put one together, but thank you for volunteering. What I'm going to do is put together a very rough sort of first cut of this. And then we really need to have some conversations about what information do we need in here, what's useful, what's not useful, what's distracting. So I'm probably going to recruit you to help me with that, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think there's two things here we're talking about. There's just the laundry list of all the funding programs, right? And how they fit together. But then there's also the strategy and how you actually implement those programs. Because there's some overlap in some of the activities you can do between the programs and some you can't. So it's important to know the details of that. But also the broader sense of what Commissioner Cooper was talking about, of how do you develop a shared strategy to have people move forward in a local area, right? And that, I think, in some ways, that flow chart would be helpful, but that's where I would question also, if we put a lot of time into that, it's more just you need to have a county commissioner the U.S. Forest Service and or BLM, like major federal land management agencies. You need to have Office of Emergency Management, right? You need to have these key people. You need to have nonprofits. And those, if you have the right mix of people in there, tribal nations, they know how to access their specific pots of funds and what they can and can't do, but it's about bringing the right people together and having people all move forward with the same strategy. So I think there's kind of two things of, and I don't know, this might be something that, like we heard from the Center for Collaborative Conservation and their statewide collaborative network, this might be something that they could help us survey. What are all the people around the state struggling with, and what would actually make a difference and help?
Brett, when you were talking, you reminded me of, and this will be something that Amy is very familiar with, this After the Flames post-fire playbook document. So this is a resource that a bunch of folks put together for communities around post-fire restoration work, primarily from a watershed perspective, to protect watersheds post-fire. And it basically kind of lays out, here are all the people you need to talk to, like here's the type of sort of organizational structure you might need, here's the data you need, here are the programs. So it just kind of got me thinking that I wonder if the framework you've sort of been alluding to, if it would look something at all like this, or not really.
Good. I think people have found that post-fire playbook to be helpful. I think what's really needed, and I don't know if that's within the purview of this, because we're focused, fire is a part of forest, but we're focused on forestry, not fire specifically, right? But it's managing, in that sense, forests before fire, during fire, and after fire, and connecting the resources around all three phases, right? Like Christy was mentioning, it's now, before a fire happened, you had one perception of the grazing permits and where you could go and the value of that. And now after a fire, it's different, but sure would be nice to have a plan for that already, assuming that things are going to burn and forest conditions are going to change.
Yeah, agreed.
That could be a model, Angela. Thanks for bringing that up.
So I think I'm hearing the one action item here is that we want the laundry list of programs, because that's really going to help us kind of, and Christy, to your point about like, what are we doing here? We want to do something. I think that laundry list of programs will help us all see that there's a lot of money out there. I mean, it might not be enough, but it is millions and millions of dollars. And so to see sort of where those millions of dollars are going currently, where they could go, what they can be spent on, I think will give this group a lot of ideas about your role in terms of making recommendations around ensuring those programs are working well together, and that you can leverage funding from different sources. But then so that's sort of to-do item number one, and then I'm hearing to-do item number two is more around this. Yeah, can we develop, sort of a strategy framework that will help folks do that work at scale through collaboration. And maybe that's something that we work for the Center for Collaborative Conservation on. So am I characterizing those two sort of approaches correctly? And do people feel like we're comfortable moving forward with both of them kind of simultaneously? And is there anything else that folks think that this group should really be trying to do?
No, I think those make sense, Angela, because I do think having the broader strategy and vision and shared tools for moving forward to leverage all of the money that's available is important. But yet, if we don't create or understand the barriers of how to leverage those sources, you still just lead people to like a very complicated puzzle. And so I think it is kind of a twofold mission here of looking at that laundry list of funding opportunities, because I think in a lot of instances, especially on the West Slope, there isn't a good understanding of where do you start, or how do you have the capacity to write 3 different grant applications and know the deadlines and matching and all of those pieces. So if we can kind of unravel that ball of yarn a bit, at the same time of really identifying the tools and strategies to make sure that as we access all of the money available, we're doing it in a way that makes sense on a statewide or landscape level scale.
Thanks for that, Amy. Just taking some notes here. And so then maybe this leads into the next agenda item here. How do you all see your role in terms of interacting with the legislative committee? So, you know, I think the legislative committee really does see it as their role to, you know, fulfill this duty around making some specific legislative recommendations. And so, yeah, how do you all see yourself interacting with them?
Well, can we stay pretty clear on their timelines, Angela? Because I think it seems to make sense for this committee to come up with recommendations specific to tweaks to existing funding programs, while also learning if they have ideas. It'd be great to share it with this group, but just making sure that we dovetail on the timelines to either recommend adjustments to state statute, or if it's federal, making sure we're aligning with the Farm Bill negotiations or whatever arena those conversations are going to take place at.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I don't know if I'll have to go back and look at the notes if we nailed this down in the last meeting, but we did discuss doing twice a year, making recommendations twice a year. So once sort of in early summer to inform the Wildfire Matters Review Committee here at the state, and then once in the winter, really sort of 6 months later, as you know, as conversations have evolved.
Yeah. Angela, I was just rereading your excellent email you sent me about the differences between the two committees.
Yeah,
Last.
you can help remind me.
Yeah, it was about fundamental differences. The legislative committee develops recommendations for new programs, and this leveraging resources committee sort of makes recommendations on how existing and confirmed programs and resources can be better aligned and leveraged.
Interesting, yeah. You know, and I don't know that I would necessarily say that exactly now, because I think that some important legislation is legislation that will make tweaks to existing programs. But with that being said, there are ways to tweak programs without changing legislation, right? So I think that this group could play a really important role on that side as well. You know, if there are ways that programs can be improved that doesn't require a change to legislation, I think this group could make those recommendations.
Hale, I gotta jump and run over to the Capitol to talk about a potential WUI code. So I really appreciate this group, and I think it's a much needed conversation. I mean, I think we continue to talk in circles around what resources are available and how do we best use the money that's being created that's never enough. So how do we be most efficient with it? So I'm hopeful that this group can really get us headed down the right path on this issue. Thank you.
But this can be an open conversation. I mean, like Brett, if you like that distinction, it's a distinction we could propose to the legislative committee.
With that distinction, it makes it, I would assume that the legislative committee would not have conversations about doing statewide prioritization or local prioritization or those kind of things. That would not seem within their purview, whereas it could fit within this purview of this committee in how it was defined.
I kind of like the stronger delineation myself, because then it allows us to really focus more on what it sounds like we should be focusing on. And then if we ran into a snag and there was a program that couldn't be implemented, then that's where we interact with the legislative committee and let them know, like, hey, this doesn't work because of this reason. I'm much more of a fan of a more clear mission statement so that we can get busy. You guys will have to bear with me. I'm impatient.
No, that's valuable, Christy, to have on any council like this.
And one other thought, just for you guys to help me. I am the least educated person on the entire council about all the programs and what's out there. You guys all have years and years and years of work and experience. And so sometimes, it's far over my head. But I'm thinking about like the water stuff and how it took years and years and years to get the public educated. And so, it's making me think right now that, that just the public education component is going to be huge. And all of this information that you all have trapped in your minds, it might be good to start getting the public up to speed so that they can hop on board, instead of, I think it'll just be valuable. I'm just, it's amazing how much information you all have. And it'll be good to put that to use.
So Angela, I'll maybe throw a question at you too. There's just within the DNR, there's a lot of forestry programs. The Colorado Conservation Board has their wildfire ready watersheds, and they're on a whole nother plan and set of programs and funding. There's lots of stuff even just within the DNR that I know people around the state are, like Christy was saying, certain people know about certain programs, but not others. And there's confusion about, should I apply for this or that, or how do they work together? How is there a role that we could play to help, just as a concrete example, the DNR programs, and how you're already trying to coordinate and give people information on that? Like, what are we going to do that's not already happening? Is there a thought there where you would look to us of like, can you help us?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Sort of thinking like program by program. Well, and I would think it's going to vary a lot program to program as well, because, for example, I would, just thinking about like Chris Sturm at the Colorado Water Conservation Board. He's been around for a while, right? And, Amy knows him well. And I would suspect that when folks apply for some of the watershed restoration grants that he administers, he has enough experience to be able to coach them pretty effectively on some of the federal programs that those dollars could potentially leverage, for example. Whereas, COSWAP, our stimulus funded program here in EVO, my staff working on that are quite new, and they themselves may not necessarily have the sort of depth of knowledge to be able to, make those same recommendations to different groups. But at the same time, I will say that that program, for instance, isn't necessarily structured to help people with that on the front end, right? Like we basically put out a grant opportunity and we ask people to apply, and in one case it requires a match, but we don't provide information on where that match might come from, for example. Right. And, and so I don't know if that's the type of thing that this group would want to sort of look at across the programs, and make some recommendations around as part of, this framework or strategy that we're sort of talking broadly about, developing to assist local folks with developing programs. I don't know. We really just say, like, you've got to bring, in this case, 25% match. We don't say really anything about where that comes from. And so folks are, and I would imagine that's the case across a lot of grant programs, right? They don't necessarily say, and here are some places you could think about raising that match,
I think,
Yeah.
I mean, I think those are some potential deliverables, I guess, for lack of a better word, of this committee is, you know, putting ourselves in the shoes of X community or X individual of, you know, where do they start for some of this? And you have some Chris Sturms in the world that are really great at saying, here's your 3 ideas for matching. But, you know, I think it is just such a puzzle out there of different funding sources. Then the timelines might not line up of, okay, you made it through this grant program and now you need to secure X dollars of match. And here's some deadlines that don't line up. And so now you're waiting till the next construction season because a lot of these communities only have narrow windows of when you could do work. So I think trying to unravel some, you know, case studies of here's an example of, you know, a project that got done and here's how they matched together these 3 funding sources. You know, we could explore, you know, starting with this flow chart or starting with here's the kind of breadth of funding opportunities available. Here's sort of your next step of, yeah, channeling our inner Chris Sturm of here's how you kind of match these pieces together.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess I don't really envision trying to hold people's hand on where to get match. I think that's more of the stepping back a level of what's the broader framework of if you're going to do this kind of work in your local community, these are the kind of people that you need to be in touch with. And how to sort of build a coalition, right? And a strategy for building that sustained capacity back to the sort of legislation.
I just think, Brett, you might be overemphasizing how easy it is for certain groups that are much farther along to figure out the different funding streams as opposed to areas of the state that are starting from scratch. And so it's, yeah, I don't want to, you know, spend all of our time holding hands, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of communities that have no idea where to start.
Yeah, I think where I've seen that in a lot of places in Western Colorado is the first thing is getting people sort of excited and aligned, moving in same direction to want to do things. And once that happens, then you start asking questions about, okay, now how do we get funding to do this together? And it starts to sort of snowball and build momentum in that way is kind of another approach of before, you know, if there's just a small group of people or people who feel like they don't know the grant programs and they're just sort of reaching for straws for funding. Again, that leads to what you were saying earlier, Amy, of like someone's doing a project over here and someone's doing a project over there and they're not talking as well to each other. And I think that's what, as a council, we want to try and encourage people to, and even in this committee, it was collaboration across agencies, organizations, jurisdictions is sort of what we're working towards. So yeah, the funding, I don't want to downplay, you know, you need money. And finding ways to get the funding is, I know not everybody has the same resources to do that, but I would just send them to Chris Sturm. I don't know that our role, we need to do that role too, right?
Yeah, these are great questions. And I'm just looking at the time here and I'm thinking that these might be questions that we need to resolve at our next meeting with a broader conversation. And I'm also thinking, how do people feel about electing a chair, or do you think this is something we should table for the next meeting? And we can ask people to come to that meeting prepared to nominate themselves or nominate somebody else. Yeah, go ahead, Christy.
I would be, it seems like Brett and Amy both would be, either of you guys would be great at heading this up because I think you both just know a lot and seem to be available. I think that's important too. So, I mean, I'm totally happy if we can elect somebody to chair, and that seems like an easy task that we could do if either one of you guys are willing to take that on.
I'm just waiting for you to speak first, Brett.
You half volunteered earlier.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
so,
Well, I'm happy to take it on, and I do think creating it seems like we've got sort of this twofold mission, and we can kind of put some, maybe Angela and we could work together on prepping for how to accomplish sort of both pathways that we've talked about here.
So Amy, does that sound like you'd consider the role? If so, I'll nominate Amy Moyer to chair this committee.
All right, do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, great, Brett. And do we have any dissent? John, do you disagree with this?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, thank you. Great, Amy, you are now the committee chair. Thanks.
Sounds good.
And I'm sure those who couldn't attend today will be okay with it, but we'll let them know.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of, like, half of the committee wasn't here, right? So there's a lot
Yeah.
of people.
And Amy, one of our first tasks will be trying to find a time that works for the most folks. It's never going to work for everybody, but.
Do we have a sense, Angela, of how frequently this committee wanted to meet? Because I can't remember if it was the confusion of, but what bi-monthly actually means.
Yeah. I recall it was about 50-50. And so that does depend on what bi-monthly actually means. So I think something between twice a month and once every 2 months is probably about right. But I would suggest, as we get things figured out here at the beginning, maybe we meet a little bit more frequently, just so folks aren't losing the thread, and we can really nail down this committee's duties. So you and I can work offline on that, figure out what might work for folks. All right. Well, I did put 10:50, I think, is the end time for this meeting. So if anybody has to jump off, please do. Are there any other items that you feel like we haven't discussed in this meeting that you think we do need to get on the radar of this committee? Yeah, anything at all. Go ahead, Christy.
Can we come up with a mission statement during our next meeting?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think also just clarifying, there's 2 committees that you're forming right now with the Forest Health Council. And I think you mentioned maybe a third one, Angela, coming on. But during this call today, we talked about overlapping duties with like 4 other of those bullet points in the charter. So just knowing more about what, given our limited capacity on everyone's in the council to do lots of committees, how many of those other things we want to try and tackle, and letting other people on the committee, on the larger council, know kind of what, like Christy said, what our mission is and what we are and aren't doing.
Yes, I think that's a great suggestion, Brett.
So is there one other committee you're thinking about getting going? Am I right on that, or are there more, or not?
Well, so I think when I sent out that initial poll, I basically took each of the duties, the statutory duties, and had people vote on whether they thought there should be a committee associated with that. And the most interest we got besides these 2 topics were, I think third was landscape scale planning to identify state level priorities for forest restoration. And so that one, I suppose it is an open question, to what extent this committee could fulfill some of that. I had sort of envisioned that as like a statewide prioritization exercise, or just looking at all of the existing statewide prioritization exercises that have gone on and having conversations about that. But, landscape scale, you could also be talking about individual landscapes and how to ensure that folks have access to the types of planning tools that, Hillary was talking about today. I think that's a good question. But then the more discrete one was development of and recommendations for attaining a 30-year vision for forest health in Colorado, including developing goals, both annual and multi-year recommendations for actions. I mean, I'm curious how, how the council thinks about that sort of long-term visioning exercise and what they want their role to be there. You know, I think we've had some people say, well, 30 years, that's not a useful vision. It's too far out. But I don't know, there might be other folks who think otherwise and want to do some of that longer range visioning for the state. So I think that's an open conversation. And one, it sounds like folks thought we could maybe leave till the fall. But again, I don't know what it looks like in terms of whether it's a separate committee or whether, you know, these are conversations we have as a full council. I think those are open questions.
Does it say anywhere in the legislation that created the council that there has to be one committee for each of those bullet points, or is that just how you're, so like our committee could say we're tackling 3 of these sort of provisions that the whole council is tasked with if it went that direction?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything stopping you from doing that. I think you just have to, whatever can work with the bandwidth that folks have. Yeah, I mean, there are so many, like, we were never going to address all of these in 1 year, you know. I mean, at some point, I think we'll want to have, you know, conversations about workforce development specifically, but that also could be something, for instance, that the legislative committee tackles in terms of making some specific legislative recommendations about workforce development. So I do think there are opportunities for overlap. All right. Oh, go ahead, Amy.
Oh, I was just going to say, as a next step for developing the mission, we can kind of circle which of these pieces, I guess, of the legislative framework that we might try and tackle in full or in part as part of this subgroup.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I can send out, you know, to keep everything kosher with sort of open meetings laws, I can send out a document with this language in there and ask folks, you know, to do that work. And Amy, you and I can sort of collate people's thoughts maybe before the next meeting. Great. All right. Well, I've got to jump to another meeting here, but I will send around the recording and the notes, and Amy and I will get another meeting on the calendar. So thanks, everybody. I know this is hard at the beginning of anything, but I think we got somewhere. So really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Angela.
Thanks all. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.